The smell of sawdust and aged oak still clung to my clothes as I pulled into the gravel driveway of my childhood home. It was Thursday evening, and I'd spent the last 12 hours in my father's workshop, carefully cataloging his tools for what I thought would be a proper inventory. Dad had been gone 3 months now, and I was finally ready to organize the space that had been his sanctuary for over 30 years. My name is Jake Morrison, and I'm a master carpenter with 15 years of experience building custom furniture for clients across the Pacific Northwest. Everything I knew about woodworking, I learned from my father, Thomas Morrison, in that very workshop behind our family home in rural Oregon. While other kids played video games, I was learning to read wood grain, understanding the difference between a mortise chisel and a paring chisel, and developing the patience that separates true craftsmen from weekend hobbyists. What most people didn't know was that my expertise extended beyond woodworking. During my time at Oregon State, I double majored in forestry and geology, writing my senior thesis on mineral deposits in the Cascade Range. I understood soil composition, mineral rights law, and land surveying almost as well as I understood dovetail joints and wood finishing. The house looked different in the fading light. My mother, Linda, had remarried 2 years ago to Frank Kellerman, a loud, heavy-set man who sold insurance and treated our family property like his personal kingdom. Frank had never understood my father's workshop, viewing it as a waste of valuable space that could be better utilized. As I walked toward the back door, something felt wrong. The workshop, which should have been locked tight, stood wide open. Light spilled from the doorway, and I could hear voices, multiple voices, coming from inside. I quickened my pace, rounding the corner of the house to see a sight that stopped me cold. 3 men were systematically loading my father's tools into a large pickup truck. His prized 1952 Delta table saw, the hand planes he'd inherited from his own father, the custom-built workbench where I'd learned to turn my first bowl. Everything was being carried out like inventory from a closing store. "Hey!" I called out, breaking into a run. "What the hell is going on here?" Frank emerged from the workshop, a clipboard in his hand and a satisfied smirk on his face. He wore his usual uniform, khaki pants that strained against his belly, a polo shirt with visible sweat stains, and the kind of cheap dress shoes that squeaked when he walked. "Jake," he said, not bothering to look apologetic, "didn't expect you back so soon. Why are these men taking my father's tools?" I demanded, watching as one of them struggled to load Dad's precision router table. Frank's smirk widened. "Your daddy's gone, boy. Time to stop living in the past." The casual cruelty of those words hit me like a physical blow. I looked at the men loading the truck. They moved with the efficiency of professionals, clearly not random thieves but legitimate buyers who'd arranged this transaction. "You sold them," I said, the reality sinking in. "Damn right I did," Frank replied, consulting his clipboard. $8,000 for the lot. Not bad for a bunch of old tools gathering dust. $8,000. I knew the value of those tools better than anyone. The Lie-Nielsen hand planes alone were worth $3,000. The vintage Stanley chisels, still sharp after decades of use, were collector's items worth hundreds each. The total value was closer to $30,000. "You can't do this," I said, stepping toward the truck. "These tools belong to—" "To who?" Frank cut me off. "Your dad's dead, Jake. And last I checked, this property belongs to me and your mother now." One of the buyers, a thin man with calloused hands, looked uncomfortable. "Maybe we should wait," he said to Frank. "If there's a family dispute." "There's no dispute," Frank said firmly. "I've got the bill of sale right here." Everything's legal. He pulled a folded paper from his pocket and waved it in my direction. I could see my mother's signature at the bottom, right next to Frank's scrawled name. "Where's my mother?" I asked. "Linda's inside watching her shows. She agrees this is for the best. Can't have you hanging around here forever, playing with Daddy's toys." The men continued loading, and I watched each piece of my inheritance disappear into the truck bed. The spokeshave my father had made by hand. The mortising machine he'd saved for months to buy. The collection of wooden handles, each one worn smooth by decades of use. "This isn't over," I said quietly. Frank laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the workshop walls. "Yeah, it is. You need to grow up, Jake. Find yourself a real job instead of playing carpenter with dead man's tools." I watched the truck drive away, taillights disappearing into the Oregon darkness. Frank headed back toward the house, whistling tunelessly, leaving me standing in the empty workshop. The space felt hollow now, echoing with the absence of 30 years of accumulated craftsmanship. But as I stood there in the dim light, I remembered something Frank had overlooked, something my father had specifically mentioned to me just months before his death. "Jake," Dad had said, sitting on his workbench after finishing a particularly challenging restoration project, "there's something you need to know about this land. Something I never told Linda or anyone else." He pulled out a manila envelope from his desk drawer, yellowed with age. Inside were documents I'd barely glanced at then, focused as I was on learning his techniques for steam-bending wood. "When my father bought this property in 1963, Dad had continued, he made sure to retain the mineral rights, separate from the surface rights. I've never done anything with them, but they're yours when I'm gone, all legal and proper." At the time, I'd nodded absently, more interested in discussing lumber grades than legal documents. But now, standing in the violated space of my father's workshop, those words took on new significance. I drove home to my apartment in town, my mind racing. That night, I pulled out every document my father had ever given me, searching through the box I'd stored in my closet after his funeral. Birth certificates, insurance papers, the deed to his workshop space, and there, at the bottom, the mineral rights documentation. The papers were complex, full of legal language that took me hours to parse. But the essentials were clear. Thomas Morrison had retained exclusive mineral rights to a 12-acre parcel that included the workshop, the surrounding forest, and the hillside behind the house. Those rights were specifically bequeathed to me, his son, completely separate from any property transfer involving the surface land. More importantly, I remembered something from my geology coursework. The Cascade Range was rich in zeolite deposits, minerals used in water filtration, industrial catalysts, and construction materials. A professor had mentioned that particular area of Oregon as having significant commercial potential that had never been properly surveyed. The next morning, I called Peterson Geological Surveys, a firm I'd worked with during my university research. Dr. Amanda Peterson had been my thesis advisor and one of the few people who understood both the academic and commercial aspects of mineral exploration. "Jake," she said when I explained the situation, "are you certain about the mineral rights?" "Completely certain. I got the documentation. And your stepfather sold surface assets without realizing he doesn't own what's underneath." That's exactly what happened. There was a pause. "You know, I've been wanting to do a survey of that area for years. The geological reports from the 1970s suggested significant zeolite deposits, but no one ever followed up." Within a week, Dr. Peterson had arranged for a full mineral survey of the property. The process required accessing the land, which meant dealing with Frank and my mother. I drove out to the house on a Saturday morning, armed with legal documents and a surveyor's map. Frank was in the backyard, grilling burgers and drinking beer despite the early hour. When he saw me approaching with a folder full of papers, his expression shifted from casual hostility to genuine irritation. "What do you want now, Jake? Come to cry about the tools some more?" "I need to inform you that I'll be conducting a geological survey of the mineral deposits on this property," I said, keeping my voice level. Frank nearly choked on his beer. "The what now?" I handed him a copy of the mineral rights deed. My father retained mineral rights to this land when he transferred surface ownership. I'm exercising those rights to conduct a commercial survey. He stared at the document like it was written in hieroglyphics. "Mineral rights? What the hell are you talking about?" "The legal right to extract minerals from beneath the surface of this property. It's completely separate from surface ownership." Frank's face was turning red, the way it always did when he encountered something he didn't understand, but sensed was threatening to his authority. "This is bullshit," he said, waving the papers. "You can't just come onto my property and start digging holes." "Actually, I can. The mineral rights grant me legal access to the property for the purpose of exploration and extraction. You'll want to have your attorney review those documents." My mother appeared on the back porch, drawn by the sound of Frank's raised voice. Linda Morrison Kellerman was a small woman who'd always deferred to the men in her life. First my father, and now Frank. "What's going on?" she asked, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "Your son thinks he can dig up my backyard," Frank said. "It's not your backyard when it comes to mineral rights," I corrected. "Dad made sure of that." The survey took 3 days. Dr. Peterson's team used ground-penetrating radar, soil samples, and core drilling to map the subsurface geology. Frank spent most of those 3 days standing on the porch, glowering at the activity, but legally powerless to stop it. On the 3rd evening, Dr. Peterson called with preliminary results. "Jake," she said, and I could hear the excitement in her voice, "you need to sit down." "What did you find?" "One of the richest zeolite deposits I've ever surveyed. High-grade clinoptilolite, running through the entire hillside. Conservative estimates put the commercial value at over $2 million. I sat down heavily in my kitchen chair. $2 million. Minimum. Could be significantly more depending on extraction efficiency and market conditions. There's enough here to supply the entire Pacific Northwest water treatment industry for decades. That night, I called 3 mining companies that specialized in zeolite extraction. By morning, I had preliminary offers from all 3, with the highest bid coming in at $2.3 million for exclusive extraction rights over a 10-year period. The irony wasn't lost on me. Frank had sold $8,000 worth of my father's tools to clean up the property, not realizing he was sitting on a fortune that belonged to me. I waited a full week before returning to the house. This time, I brought my attorney, Marcus Webb, a man who specialized in mineral rights law and had handled several major extraction deals in Oregon. Frank was washing his car in the driveway when we pulled up. He straightened slowly, water dripping from the sponge in his hand, watching us approach with obvious suspicion. "Frank," I said politely, "this is Marcus Webb, my attorney. We need to discuss the mineral survey results." Frank's expression shifted from suspicion to alarm. "What kind of results?" Marcus stepped forward, briefcase in hand. "Mr. Kellerman, my client's mineral survey has revealed commercially viable deposits beneath this property. We're here to notify you of pending extraction operations." "Extraction operations?" Frank's voice cracked slightly. I opened a folder and showed him the survey maps. There's a zeolite deposit running through the entire hillside behind the house, worth approximately $2.3 million in extraction rights. Frank stared at the geological charts as if they might suddenly make sense. What does this mean? It means, Marcus said, that Mr. Morrison has legal right to extract those minerals. The process will require heavy machinery, excavation equipment, and around-the-clock operations for several months. The color drained from Frank's face. Heavy machinery? On my property? The mineral rights include surface access for extraction purposes, I explained. We'll need to bring in mining equipment, establish staging areas, and create access roads for the trucks. You can't do this, Frank said, but his voice lacked conviction. Marcus pulled out another set of documents. Mr. Kellerman, I suggest you review these mineral rights provisions carefully. Your attorney will confirm that surface owners have very limited ability to restrict subsurface extraction activities. Frank looked around wildly, as if searching for someone to appeal to. Linda, he called toward the house. My mother emerged, looking tired and confused. She'd aged noticeably since my father's death, and Frank's constant belittling had only made things worse. What's happening? She asked. Your son is trying to destroy our property, Frank said. I'm exercising legal rights that Dad specifically left to me, I corrected. The same way you exercised your right to sell his tools. The parallel wasn't lost on my mother. She looked from Frank to me, understanding beginning to dawn in her eyes. How much money? She asked quietly. The mineral rights are worth $2.3 million, Marcus replied. Frank's knees actually buckled. He leaned against his half-washed car, staring at us in horror. $2 million. 300,000. I corrected. The extraction company's offer is for $2.3 million. The silence stretched for nearly a minute. Frank opened and closed his mouth several times, but no words came out. Finally, he managed to speak. There has to be some mistake. No mistake, Marcus said. The geological survey is conclusive, and the mineral rights documentation is ironclad. Mr. Morrison's father was very thorough when he structured the property transfer. I watched Frank process this information, seeing the exact moment he realized what he'd done. He'd sold my father's tools for $8,000 while sitting on land that would generate nearly 300 times that amount. Land he couldn't touch legally. The extraction process will begin in 6 weeks, I continued. You'll want to prepare for significant disruption to your daily routine. Disruption? Frank's voice was barely a whisper. Marcus consulted his notes. Excavation equipment operates from 6 a.m. to 10 p.m., 6 days a week. There will be truck traffic, industrial noise, and temporary access roads through portions of the surface property. Frank sank onto the hood of his car, the weight of his mistake finally hitting him. This will destroy the property value. Surface property value, I agreed. But as you pointed out, I need to stop living in the past. My mother stepped forward, her voice small. Jake, is there any way to work something out? I looked at her, remembering how she'd signed the papers to sell Dad's tools without even consulting me. What kind of arrangement did you have in mind? Maybe we could share the mineral rights, since it's family? Frank perked up at this, nodding eagerly. Yeah, family should stick together. I pretended to consider the offer. Well, I suppose family is important. You're right about that. Hope flickered in Frank's eyes. Of course, I continued. I wasn't considered family when you sold my father's life's work to strangers. But I'm willing to discuss terms." "What terms?" Frank asked desperately. "First, you'll return every tool you sold from my father's workshop." "That's impossible," Frank protested. "I don't even know who bought them all." Marcus consulted his briefcase again. "Actually, we've been able to track most of the purchases through the auction house records. The total buyback cost would be approximately $15,000. Frank's face went pale again. "15,000? You said you sold them for 8. "That was a wholesale price to a dealer," I explained. "Retail replacement cost is nearly double. Second," I continued, "you'll sign over surface ownership of the workshop and surrounding 2 acres back to me. Fair market value is about $40,000. $55,000 total," Frank calculated weakly. "And third," I said, "you'll publicly apologize for your disrespect to my father's memory and acknowledge that you were wrong to dispose of his tools without consulting his son." Frank looked like he might be sick. "And if I agree to all that, then I'll pay you 10% of the mineral extraction proceeds, about $230,000 over the 10-year contract period." It wasn't a generous offer, but it was more money than Frank would see in a lifetime of selling insurance, and it was far more than he deserved. "We'll need your decision within 48 hours, Marcus said. "The extraction company requires clarity on surface access agreements before they begin operations." As we drove away, I could see Frank in my rearview mirror, still sitting on his car hood, staring at the hillside behind his house like it had personally betrayed him. The next morning, Frank called my attorney. He agreed to every term. The buyback process took 3 weeks. Frank had to liquidate part of his retirement savings to purchase the tools from their new owners, many of whom were reluctant to sell. The 1952 Delta table saw a loan cost him $2,200 to buy back, nearly 3 times what he'd sold it for. I was there when the tools returned to the workshop, watching Frank personally carry each piece back to its original place. His hands shook as he positioned my father's hand planes on their designated shelf, and sweat soaked through his shirt despite the cool Oregon weather. "This the last of them," Frank said as he placed the final chisels set on the workbench. I ran my hand along the familiar surface of my father's most prized possession, the custom workbench he built from old-growth Douglas fir. "You know, Frank, these tools are worth more than you paid to get them back." His shoulders sagged. "I figured that out. My father spent 30 years collecting these. Each one has a story, a purpose. They're not just tools. They're a legacy." Frank nodded miserably. I didn't understand. "No," I agreed. "You didn't." The mineral extraction began 2 months later. True to Marcus's warning, the operation completely disrupted life at the house. Massive trucks rumbled past Frank's front door at all hours, hauling zeolite ore to processing facilities in Portland. The noise was constant, the dust inevitable. Frank and my mother moved into a rental house in town after the 2nd week. The insurance salesman who'd been so proud of his rural property found himself essentially homeless, watching from a distance as heavy machinery carved into the hillside behind what had been his sanctuary. The extraction process revealed even more extensive deposits than Dr. Peterson had initially projected. The mining company increased their offer twice, eventually settling on a total contract value of $2.8 million. Frank's 10% amounted to $280,000, paid in quarterly installments over the contract period. It was more money than he'd ever seen at once, but it came with a constant reminder of how much more he'd cost himself through ignorance and greed. On a crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after Frank had sold my father's tools, I stood in the restored workshop, running my hand along the familiar workbench. Every tool was back in its proper place, the space once again feeling like the sanctuary my father had intended. The mineral extraction was nearly complete, the hillside scarred, but healing. Frank and my mother had moved permanently to town, unable to tolerate the disruption to their quiet rural life. They'd eventually sold their surface rights to a developer who planned to build vacation cabins once the mining operation concluded. I used a portion of the mineral proceeds to purchase those surface rights myself, ensuring that my father's workshop would remain undisturbed. The rest of the money went into a trust fund that would support my woodworking business and eventually fund a vocational school for traditional crafts. Sometimes I think about Frank's incredulous question, $2 million? He'd said it like an accusation, as if I'd somehow cheated him by knowing things he didn't. But that was always his problem. He never understood that knowledge has value, that respecting the past can unlock the future, and that dismissing someone as a dreamy boy playing with daddy's toys can be the most expensive mistake of your life. My father had taught me that good craftsmanship requires patience, attention to detail, and respect for the materials you work with. Those same principles applied to legal documents, mineral rights, and family relationships. Frank had failed to understand any of them. As I selected a chisel from my father's restored collection and began work on a new project, I could almost hear Dad's voice echoing in the workshop. Measure twice, cut once, son, and always check your facts before you make a deal. It was advice Frank probably wished he'd received before he decided to sell a dead man's tools and sit on a fortune he didn't know he couldn't touch. The workshop was quiet now, except for the familiar sounds of woodworking, the whisper of sharp steel through aged hardwood, the gentle tap of mallet on chisel, the soft susurrus of sandpaper smoothing rough edges. These were the sounds of patience rewarded, of legacy preserved, and of justice served with compound interest. Outside, autumn rain drummed against the windows, and the scarred hillside slowly began its recovery. But inside the workshop, surrounded by my father's tools and sustained by his wisdom, everything was exactly as it should be.